So where did we get the idea of individual rights? Do I even need to answer that question by now? From the Catholic Church, believe it or not. We're going to talk about that and a lot more today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. In all the episodes up through today, we've been talking about aspects of Western civilization that are indebted to the Catholic Church. And yet, most people know nothing about this. So it's time we rectify that. Now today, I've got something else interesting for you that I think most people don't know about and they're not taught in school. But what was the first modern legal system in Europe? Guess what? It wasn't English common law, it was the canon law of the Catholic Church. Because for the first time, you had a single systematic body of law. Canon law, of course the Church's law, became a model for the emerging states of Western Europe. Because what in fact happened is that the Church's law had never really, until about the 12th century, had never been collected into a single source. It was scattered everywhere. If you wanted to find church law, there was no book you could go to. You would find aspects of church law in the Bible, in the church fathers, in local councils, ecumenical councils, papal statements, whatever. But there was no systematic source that you could consult. And that came to an end in the year 1140, when a man named Gratian wrote the Concordance of Discordant Canons. And this work brought together and synthesized all these various sources of the Church's law, and brought them together and made them into a single coherent whole. And in effect, by doing that, Gratian showed the Western world how you put together a legal system, how you take disparate elements that are scattered and you bring them together into a single whole that makes sense. Now, this is not always so easy, because when you have so many sources of law, it's not surprising that sometimes you find contradictions. One source says you should do A, another source says you should do B. When you're bringing the law all together, how do you resolve that? Should you do A or B? And what Gratian and other canon lawyers showed is that you use the idea of natural law to arbitrate between these two alternatives. So, in other words, the idea of natural law is that there are certain principles, even before human beings write up any law, there are certain principles that we know to be right, that we know to be wrong, because they are written on our hearts, as we learn in the Bible. So the natural law becomes the way you decide, is this the rule we should abide by, or is this rule? Natural law can help you adjudicate that. Well, the countries of Western Europe, as they were coming out of the feudal period of Europe, they had totally scattered legal systems too. They had this kind of law, that kind of law, all kinds of directives all over the place, and no coherence. So when they went to put together a modern legal system, what did they consult as a model? The canon law of the Catholic Church. Don't you think that's kind of interesting? Well, it's not just the structure of the canon law that's important. It's not simply that it showed people how to take a lot of different sources and put them together into one code of law. That's important. But it's also the content of canon law that matters. It's also some of the things that canon law taught rubbed off on law in general. For instance, the Church had jurisdiction over marriage in the Middle Ages, and the canon law of marriage held that a valid marriage involves the free and informed consent of both the man and the woman. So you can't force people to get married, you can't get them drunk and then get them married, you need to have their free and informed consent. Well, what does that mean? Well, in fact, Harold Berman, who's probably the greatest historian of law in the Western tradition by far, he's a 20th century historian, Harold Berman says that right here in the Church's canon law of marriage, emphasizing consent as the heart of the marriage bond. He says here were the foundations not only of the modern law of marriage, but also of certain basic elements of modern contract law, namely the concept of free will, that you have to enter into a contract freely the same way you do in a marriage. We also see, he says, the related concepts of mistake, duress, and fraud, because the Church's canon law of marriage also told us that if people have made a mistake about the identity or some important quality of their putative spouse, that the marriage is also not valid. So these are basic aspects of all contract law, and yet here they are deriving from the canon law of marriage, not particularly well known. What's also important is that it was very common, the practice of what we might call infant marriage in Western Europe. This was a barbarian custom, and infant marriage, of course, is incompatible with the Church's canon law of marriage, because how can an infant give his consent to a marriage? So it was with the implementation of the canon law of marriage that the barbarian custom of infant marriage was abolished altogether. Now, one of my favorite aspects of all this is that the Church's canon law, coming into being in a systematic way in the 12th century, for the first time is now bringing into Western European practice, for the first time since the barbarian invasions, a clear emphasis on the importance of rational trial procedures. Now, what do I mean by that? Typically, in barbarian modes of law, reason was not employed to determine who was guilty and who was innocent. Rather, magical modes of determining guilt or innocence were used, modes of ordeal. So, for instance, one barbarian method of determining whether you were guilty or innocent consists of what we might call the ordeal by hot water. And here you'd take the accused person and you'd bring him over to a cauldron in which boiling water had at the bottom a stone. And it was required of the accused to reach into that scalding water and pull the stone out. Then they would bandage his arm, because of course it's scalding water and his arm's not doing too well at this point. Then they'd wait 3 days. When they take off the bandages, if he has begun to scab up on his arm, then that means he's innocent. But if he hasn't yet started to scab up, that is indication of his guilt. Well, who wants to be subject to this kind of procedure? This is exactly the kind of thing that the rational trial procedures emphasized in canon law helps to bring to an end. Now, another barbarian method of determining guilt or innocence is the ordeal by cold water. Well, that sounds fine. Cold water, refreshing, right? Well, the ordeal by cold water consisted of tying a person's hands together and his feet together and throwing him in the river, and then observing to see whether he sinks or floats. Now, in many versions of the ordeal by cold water, if you float, that is indication of your guilt. You might think that floating would mean you're pure, like ivory soap, you're 99.44% pure, but to the contrary, the thinking was that perhaps the divine principle in the water is trying to eject you by not allowing you to sink. So that's an indication of your guilt. Well, again, nobody would want to live under that system. And in fact, that system doesn't really tell us who's guilty, who's innocent. It just tries to end the dispute. Look, this is how it turned out for this guy. He floated. That's the end of it. Let's just stop the fight right here. Instead of pursuing justice, barbarian law simply tried to stop feuding and fighting by just coming up with some kind of an answer, even though it was a totally arbitrary answer, whether the guy floats, whether his arm scabs up. This is exactly what canon law was opposed to. So, canon law, the first modern legal system in Western Europe. But there's much more to be said about the Church's contributions here, because as long as we're speaking about law, we can speak about the concept of rights. That I have a right to life. I have a right to own property. I have a right to enter into a contract or enter into a marriage. I have the right to defend myself in a court of law. All these things are rights. Where does that idea of rights come from? For a long time, rights come from. For a long time, it was assumed that the idea of rights just sort of spontaneously emerged somewhere around the 17th century, give or take. That was the standard view. All of a sudden, people thought of the idea of rights. That is no longer a sustainable view. And once again, modern scholars, believe it or not, are coming to the defense of the church and showing that, in fact, the idea of rights is not confined to the 17th century. It goes all the way back to the 12th century, where we see the language of rights beginning. Now that's interesting, but before we get into that any further, I think I should address some, discomfort that Catholics may sometimes have with the concept of rights. Because I think today we live in a culture in which everybody claims that anything he wants to do is a right. I have the right to do this, the right to do that. It almost makes rights language seem empty or even dangerous. So I simply want to clarify, a right simply means that you possess a kind of immunity from invasion. If I have a right to life, it means that it would be wrong for you to invade my life violently. That's all that means. It's a kind of immunity I have against aggression. That, in effect, is what a right is. Now, what interests us particularly is the concept of natural rights. A natural right is a right that you have because you're a human being. By nature, you enjoy this right. So a natural right is not given to you by a government. It's something you possess by virtue of being a human being. And it's a good thing that natural rights are not given to you by government, because what governments give, governments can take away. So the concept of natural rights is what really matters. And the reason that the concept of natural rights can be born in the 12th century is that that was a culture in which the language of rights was already very prevalent. And so the concept of natural rights had fertile soil in which to grow. For example, in the late 11th century, popes and kings were having a war of words in the investiture controversy. Who's allowed to appoint and install bishops? Well, popes would speak about their rights, and kings would speak about their rights. Lords and vassals in feudal Europe, they have rights and obligations. Medieval towns had rights against the king. So, in fact, the concept of rights is embedded deeply in the 12th century. But what develops out of it is the concept of natural rights. Now, how is that different? The right I have as a pope to install bishops is not a natural right. Not all human beings have the right to install bishops. That's a right you have as a pope. A natural right is a right that everybody possesses by virtue of being human. But people who are constantly thinking about rights, the rights of the pope, the rights of the king, the rights of the lords, the rights of the vassals, the rights of the medieval town, well, these are people who are going to start thinking, aren't there just rights that human beings possess because they're human beings? And we start to see from about 1150 to 1300, this crucial period is where we really begin to see the concept of natural rights blossom. So this came out of the heart of the church. This wasn't developed by the church's enemies. The church was way, way ahead of everybody on the concept of rights. But now let's take this idea and develop it even further, because we're going to be coming back from the break in a minute. We're going to talk more about why natural rights are so important and the church's role. So come on back and join me. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're talking about law and rights. And we've seen so far that the Church gave Western Europe its first modern legal system with its canon law. There was nothing like that up to that time. And then beyond that, it's the Church and her canon lawyers, her church lawyers, who begin to introduce the concept of natural rights, which means that human beings, simply because they are human beings, are endowed with certain rights. That is to say, they are endowed with certain immunities so that they cannot be invaded or aggressed against in these areas of their lives. Now, just before the break, I emphasized in particular the crucial period from about 1150 to 1300, when you begin to see church lawyers starting to think of all kinds of areas of life as possessing natural rights to them. For example, the right to property, the right to defend yourself in self-defense, and also to defend yourself in a court of law, and so on and on, much, much more as well. All these things were beginning to be viewed as natural rights that trumped the claims of governments. In fact, as recently as Pope Leo XIII's encyclical, Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII said that the right to property is sacred and inviolable. And that, in effect, means that nobody's allowed to interfere with your enjoyment of your property. And then in other cases, we're talking about the enjoyment of your life or the enjoyment of other rights. But these are things that you enjoy because you're a human being, and that no government can take away. You have these things before government even comes along into the picture. Now, this is a very important idea. It's a central concept in Western civilization. And these are universal rights. They're not rights that are enjoyed just by European human beings, but by all human beings. And they're not rights that are enjoyed only by Catholics, members of the faithful in the state of grace, but these are rights that are enjoyed by all people, regardless of what faith they profess. Now, it's interesting to note that in the 13th century, there had really begun to develop a very exaggerated understanding of the Pope's authority. That it was argued that the Pope, because he was the vicar of Christ on earth, in effect owned everything. And individuals enjoyed their possessions only because he allowed them to. And in the 13th century, Pope Innocent IV specifically renounced this view and said no. He said ownership, possession, and jurisdiction can belong to non-Catholics as well. Because the original argument was that the Pope owns everything and he lets Catholics enjoy property, but he has the right to deprive others of property. And Pope Innocent IV said this is complete nonsense. Catholics and non-Catholics alike, regardless of what the Pope believes about them or wants to do, can own their own property, because all rational creatures were intended to have the right to property. So this concept of rights begins to develop over the centuries, beginning with 1150 to 1300, and it reaches its height and its culmination with people we call the late scholastics, people in the 16th and 17th centuries. And in particular, the scholastics who were teaching at Spanish universities, and I mentioned before the University of Salamanca, they taught that not only do Europeans and not only do Catholics have these rights, and not only do non-Europeans and non-Catholics have these rights, but also peoples we've never heard of before. The natives of the New World, we're just meeting for the first time. Those people have the same rights to property and rights to life and rights to self-government that we have in Europe. And that's an astonishing claim, because if you look at the history of the interaction of peoples who are different from each other, you don't really see a whole lot of examples of foreign people saying to each other, oh, you have the same rights I have, because we all have a rational nature and we're made in the image and likeness of God, and so we're all equal and we have natural rights. Of course you don't see that. You don't see that at all. But this is the liberating idea that the Catholic Church brings into the world, that people all enjoy these natural rights equally. Now, that's long before John Locke talks about natural rights. He's writing in the late 1600s. This is the 12th century. That's a major contribution by the Catholic Church. Well, finally for today, my last segment involves an aspect of Western law that has been almost completely forgotten, but that thanks to Harold Berman, whose book I earnestly recommend, Law and Revolution, it's been resurrected. And what Berman tells us in his book is that if you look at the history of Western law, it is deeply informed by religious conviction and belief and religious ideas. And he says that if you really want to understand Western law, you have to understand St. Anselm's doctrine of the atonement. Amazing. What does that mean? If I'm going to understand Western law, I have to understand St. Anselm's view of the atonement, of Christ on the cross, and what that all means. Well, as a matter of fact, you do. And I'd like to take the remaining minutes to explain that. First of all, what did St. Anselm, who, as you'll recall, lived until 1109, what did he have to say about the atonement? And what on earth does that have to do with Western law and the law of crimes in the West? St. Anselm was interested to answer the question, why did God become man? It's a good question. Why did it happen? Why did God not simply reconcile the human race to himself from heaven, just sending down a declaration directly from heaven? Why does the God-man come into the world? And St. Anselm tried to answer the question in this way, just using rational principles. He said that when human beings introduced sin into the world, they in effect closed off paradise to themselves. Now, God had intended people to enjoy eternal blessedness, but yet they've introduced sin into the world, and so in a certain sense, we can, in some sense, say that we've frustrated God's intention. So how are we going to make this right? St. Anselm says we have violated God. We have in effect committed an injustice against God. The scales of justice are out of balance. The order of justice has been torn by our wrongdoing. And that needs to be repaired. And it can't be repaired by God just saying something to us from heaven. It has to be really repaired by somebody. We cannot go on. There can't be any healing, so to speak, until justice has been repaired. How is justice going to be repaired? Well, the human race could be punished, and that could repair the damage. But for the human race to be punished enough to make good what has been done to God, the human race would have to be punished to an unbelievable degree to satisfy God's justice. It's not even clear we could do it. But even if we could somehow satisfy the demands of justice, the fact is that whatever punishment it would take to us to make good what's been wrong, the wrong that's been done to God, whatever punishment it would take would probably also deprive us of eternal blessedness. So God's intention would be frustrated again. So Anselm says, look, justice itself, justice in the abstract, has been assaulted by sin. How are we going to fix that? God could fix it by declaring it fixed, but he shouldn't have to do that. Satisfaction should be made to him. Now, human beings should make satisfaction to God, but they can't. They can't offer him enough that would satisfy such a devastating demolition, in effect, of the demands of justice. So what, in fact, has to happen for this ever to be healed? There has to be a God-man whose sacrifice can be punishment enough to, in effect, heal the rupture of justice. So that is, in effect, in a real nutshell, what St. Anselm has to say about the atonement. He's saying that when wrongdoing occurs, the only way we can make good on it is if there is some punishment meted out that is proportionate to the offense. Now, in the case of sin, the offense is infinite, and the one offended is infinite. So therefore, something infinite has to be done, in effect, to make satisfaction so that this breach of justice can be healed. Well, in that type of culture, where St. Anselm's views are being spread around, it's no surprise that the idea of the law of crimes is influenced by this, because people begin to say that if you commit a crime, in the same way that the human race committed a crime against God when the human race introduced sin to the world, if you commit a crime, you're not just wronging the person you rob or kill. You are wronging justice itself. The same way the human race wronged justice itself. And we could not make any progress, and we could not satisfy justice unless this breach is somehow healed by a punishment proportionate to the crime. Well, likewise, the Western law of crimes that we are very familiar with says, if you commit a crime against some other party, how are we going to resolve it? Well, we view it as you not only having wronged that person, but you have wronged justice itself, just as the human race did against God. How are we going to reconcile that? How are we going to fix that? We have to undergo a punishment that is proportionate to the offense, in the same way that, in effect, Christ makes the atonement. And this becomes sort of second nature to people in the Western world, but it comes directly out of St. Anselm's view of the atonement. So there is fundamentally a religious aspect at the very heart of the Western concept of law. Now, to conclude today, I said a little bit earlier that the concept of rights developed thanks to the Catholic Church, and that it reached its culmination in the 16th and 17th centuries when Spanish theologians began to argue that let's consider what the implications of the idea of rights might be. Here we are discovering new peoples in the world. Those people have the same rights we do. We have no right to enslave them. We have no right to depose their rulers and install Catholic ones. We have no right to go to war with them simply because they are of different religion from what we have. And they have just as much right to own property as we have, because these are natural rights. They're not just Catholic rights, they are natural rights. And there we hear the voice of justice in the midst of a great deal of injustice that was visited upon the peoples of the New World. The voice of justice comes from the Catholic Church, reminding people there is one moral law and one set of rights that applies to everybody. And that's where we're going to pick up next time, the internationalization of the idea of natural rights. So join me next time for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. We've heard a great deal over the years about the terrible demographic tragedy that struck the peoples of the New World in the Age of Discovery. But who were the greatest and most outspoken critics of the abuses of the natives? Catholic theologians. Let's talk about this issue today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Last week we talked about the Church and law, and for a good portion we talked about the Church's role in developing the idea of natural rights. This is a central concept in Western civilization, the idea that simply by virtue of being a human being, I possess certain rights that inhere in my very nature as a rational creature, that I have the right not to be killed, not to be expropriated, have my property taken away. I have these rights by virtue of being human. And I even cited an encyclical that I consider to be sort of recent, 1891 encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, in which he specifically said that the right to property is sacred and inviolable. So nobody can come up with some pretext for violating that. So these are important, liberating ideas in the best sense of the word. Today what we're going to talk about is the extension of this idea of rights to the whole world, and the suggestion that all the peoples of the world enjoy the same fundamental dignity. Because they're made in the image and likeness of God and they have that rational nature, all of us identically share in a dignity that demands the recognition of rights. This is a revolutionary idea. There are not many peoples in the world who have looked around at all the diversity of people in the world and said, let's bestow equal rights on everybody. This is not exactly the most popular idea in the history of mankind, but it came right out of the heart of the Church. Now let's begin by looking at the exact opposite of what the Church teaches. And then we can better appreciate why the Church's message is so revolutionary. And when I look at the exact opposite of what the Church teaches, I focus specifically on one of the great villains of political philosophy. In the early 16th century, a fellow named Machiavelli, who wrote an enormous amount, wrote a small book around 1513 called The Prince. When we look at The Prince, we find a totally secular analysis of politics. God is left out of the equation altogether. Morality is left out of the equation altogether. Sound a little bit familiar? That's what modern political life, in effect, has been like. These things are to be banished. Governments have to do what they have to do. And Moral principles, will suffer in the process. Now, think about how St. Thomas Aquinas would have answered the question, what is political obligation? Or what is the nature of the state? Or what is the function of the ruler? And he would have thought, well, God's intention in establishing these institutions was, and then he would have gone on from there. Machiavelli has no truck with any of this. He's not interested in God's intention. That has no relevance to him whatsoever. Instead, Machiavelli looks at the state from the point of view of a cold, calculating theoretician. And in effect, what he wants to do is give advice to rulers. If you want to stay in power, you should do these things. And don't be caught up in moral concerns. Am I allowed to do these things? You have to do what you have to do. Because according to Machiavelli, the worst thing that can happen is the collapse of a state. So the state has to be able to do whatever it feels necessary to do to keep itself functioning. Because were it not for the state, we would all revert to a condition of civil war, of all against all, as in a later century Thomas Hobbes suggested. So therefore, the end that we have in mind, that is, keeping the state functioning and preserving the peace, is very important. So the means to that end become okay, whatever means necessary. So his advice to the prince is do what you have to do to maintain yourself in power, even if that means lying and cheating and stealing, and even worse. So, for example, it was a typical piece of Machiavellian advice to rulers that you should give the appearance of being generous, but don't be so foolish as actually to be generous. Or, it is good for you to be loved by your people, but much more important, if you can't swing that, is to be feared by them. This is classic Machiavellian advice, and part of the reason that Machiavelli despised the church and despised Christianity was that these things taught that states were subject to moral restraints. They were subject to the moral law. Machiavelli's state is subject to nothing other than necessity. And so Machiavelli would have disdained what the Catholic Church taught, that there are virtues that we ought to cultivate. We ought to cultivate the cardinal virtues of prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. We ought to pursue the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. All this falls out in Machiavelli's system, for there is only one virtue for Machiavelli, and that is the ability to survive. And that trumps everything. And that extends to states in particular. States have to survive, so they need to be able to do what they need to do. And it is unjust for a state to be held up to moral scrutiny. It won't work, it's impractical, and that, in effect, is Machiavelli's message. Now, the Church condemned Machiavelli's work in no uncertain terms. They condemned it because they believe that there are such things as moral standards when it comes to government. Now, it's one thing for a teenager to go around saying this. This is the typical teenage morality, isn't it? I'm not going to get my moral teaching from any of you people. I'll just live by my own code. You know, every teenager has this view, during the teenage years, and then most of them grow up and realize how stupid they're being. But the typical teenage mentality is, I don't need to read your Bible or listen to your preaching or even listen to my parents. I'll make up my own rules, blah, blah, blah. Now, that's bad enough when a teenager teaches that. But when a government believes that, then you're getting into something very dangerous. So what the Church teaches is that states can not only be held up for moral accountability, but they can also be held up to moral scrutiny in how they interact with other states. There are moral rules that govern how they interact with other states. They can't just do whatever they want or whatever they think is to their passing advantage. They have to be subject to the moral law. Machiavelli would be absolutely livid at this suggestion. But the Church teaches that an absolute, unchanging standard of justice applies to all peoples alike. This, in effect, is what international law is. The idea that all states are subject to certain rules and restraints. Now, let me anticipate an objection here. The fact that you believe that there is such a thing as international law does not mean you have to be the world's greatest cheerleader for the United Nations, because you may be saying, isn't the United Nations made up in large part of a bunch of bozos and dangerous and weird people, and don't they say a lot of strange things, and we would never want to be governed by these people? And I couldn't agree more. In fact, some of you may remember Bill Buckley's old statement that he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the faculty of Harvard. Well, I sort of feel that way about the United Nations General Assembly. So I don't mean to suggest that you have to be a big cheerleader for the United Nations. The question is the principle. As long as we recognize the principle that governments are subject to some kind of moral rules, then we can leave aside, for our purposes anyway, how would you enforce those rules? Because, of course, as soon as you establish a United Nations to govern the interaction of states, the question then becomes, well, who's going to govern the United Nations? You haven't really solved the problem. Who's going to make sure the United Nations is doing the right thing? So that's another matter. How do you enforce international law? Perhaps you could do it through, try to do it through moral suasion, or threatening to make the offending state an international pariah with whom no one will trade. These are possibilities. Right now, I simply want to look at the principles the Church upheld. Now, in the 16th century, from the 15th into the 16th centuries, Spanish theologians and individuals began to get reports coming back from the New World of Spanish mistreatment of the natives there. And this provoked a severe crisis of conscience among Spain's philosophers and theologians, because they began to ask themselves, how should we interact with these new peoples? Is our own government these new peoples? Is our own government upholding the moral standards in which we claim to believe? So what it did was it provoked a lot of reflection about the nature of moral obligation, and in particular, the nature of moral obligation on the international sphere. So that is to say, they began asking themselves crucial questions. How should different peoples interact with each other? How should governments interact with each other? Are there absolute rules that should be observed? Well, this interaction between Spaniards and the peoples of the New World provided an unprecedented opportunity for theologians suddenly to entertain these questions. And this is where the idea of international law comes from, as these Spanish theologians are critically evaluating the behavior of their own government. They are deciding that, yes, there are moral rules. And in fact, in some cases, our own government is not obeying them. Now, the very fact that there was a crisis of conscience among Spanish theologians is itself significant. Because think, did Attila the Hun ever stop and say, you know, I shouldn't be looting and raping and pillaging like this. I mean, how dare I do these things? These people have rights just as I do. Well, of course, it never even occurred to him to ask questions like that. Or the Aztecs, for example, who engaged in human sacrifice. We have absolutely no record of any soul-searching that occurred in Aztec civilization, of people stepping back and impartially evaluating their own society and saying, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be ripping the hearts out of people. You know, maybe this is the wrong thing to do. Maybe this is a barbaric custom. We have absolutely no indication of any such critical tradition there. And yet, within the Catholic Church, when Spanish theologians look at the behavior of their government in the New World, that's exactly what they do. Is they begin asking these questions, and they begin saying, should we behave this way? And are there, in fact, general rules we should observe that apply to all peoples? Attila the Hun didn't believe in rules that apply to all peoples. There were rules that applied to him and rules that applied to everybody else. And that has been the typical way peoples have understood their interaction with the world. We are the good people, everybody else is a barbarian, and we treat them accordingly. So this is an advance of no small significance. Now, we're coming up to the break, but when we come back, we're going to meet a figure of extraordinary importance, Father Francisco de Vitoria, who was a professor at the University of Salamanca, to which I have referred many a time. And it was Father Francisco de Vitoria who gave us the very first treatise in history on international law, setting out these principles. So let's come on back and look at that here on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. We're looking today at international law. Sounds like kind of a dry subject, but as you can see, it actually isn't at all. Because the idea of international law simply means that there are certain fixed rules that everybody has to observe. And that you can't say that, well, this people is more backward than we are, or they haven't achieved what we have, so we can just trample them and this and that. There's nothing like that in what the Catholic Church teaches. Now, just before the break, we were talking about what happened when people in Spain began to hear about some of the abuses toward the natives of the New World at the hands of some Spaniards. And so, in fact, Spanish theologians began thinking about all the implications and consequences of this. They began thinking about the questions they needed to ask. Are there rules that should govern the interaction of peoples? What are those rules? Is our own government living up to those rules? Well, Father Francisco de Vitoria, whom I mentioned immediately before the break, was a professor at the University of Salamanca. And he has sometimes been called, along with the Dutch Protestant Hugo Grotius, who came much later, the father of international law. In fact, a man named James Brown Scott, writing in the 1920s in a book called The Spanish Origin of International Law, tells us that Vitoria furnished the world of his day with its first masterpiece on the law of nations in peace as well as in war. Now, in a separate episode, we've discussed a little bit of the ins and outs of the just war theory. Now, what Vitoria was interested in was determining the treatment to which all human beings were entitled by right, by natural right, because they were human beings. And he insisted that these rights that people possessed came from their status as human beings, rather than because they were Catholics or anything else, Europeans, Spaniards. So their right not to be killed or not to be robbed. This comes to you not because, well, you're Catholic or you're of my race. It comes to you because you're a human being with a rational nature. And the exercise of these rights is the way in which you can live out your rational nature. You need to have a right to life. You need to have a right to own property in order to function in the world. So these things are natural rights. And they are rights that apply to everybody. So what this means in principle, in practice as well, is that no Catholic would argue that it's a less serious crime to kill somebody who's not baptized and a more serious crime to kill a baptized person because the baptized person is more important or something like that. Absolutely not. That is not what the Church teaches. And to the contrary, Father Domingo de Soto, who was Vitoria's colleague at the University of Salamanca, said this. He said, "Those who are in the grace of God, that is good, faithful Catholics, are not a whit better off than the sinner or the pagan in what concerns natural rights." Now again, isn't that kind of the opposite of the impression I think people have about the Church over the years? I think people have this impression that the Church would be inclined to give certain favor to those who belong to the household of faith. But to the contrary, as we see here, some of her finest thinkers in the 16th century say, if not the opposite, then they state something that is true for everybody. That all these rights are to be enjoyed equally by everybody because we all share a common human nature. And we aren't, incidentally, just a clump of cells. We are human beings with dignity, and that dignity demands these rights. Now, what does Vitoria conclude, looking at the situation of his government and the peoples of the New World? He said that the peoples of the New World, because they were human beings, just as we Spaniards are human beings, they were equal to us. They were equal to us in matters pertaining to natural rights. They owned their lands by the same principles that we Spaniards own our own. And he also argued that, and incidentally his fellow scholastics agreed with him, Domingo de Soto, Molina and others, that pagan princes ruled legitimately. That is to say, if a pagan king has committed no other crime, he can't simply be thrown out and deposed because he's a pagan. Now that too, I think, is the opposite of what people think. People would think that the Church believes that if a ruler is non-Catholic, they can just go in and throw him out and put a Catholic there. Well, in a certain way, I mean, I bet in the United States we wish we could do that sometimes, but that's not what the Church teaches. What the Church teaches and what Vittoria teaches here is that each state has the same rights as any other, the same rights to self-government, and is under an obligation to respect the rights of others. So regardless of the religion of the ruler, if that ruler has committed no other crime, nobody has a right to just topple him for no reason other than he's a non-Catholic. You can't simply do that. Now, Vittoria and his supporters also believed that the idea of natural law existed not just among Christians, but among all peoples. Now, natural law, of course, is the idea that there are laws that are in effect written in our human heart that we simply know. When you're a child, you know. You know these laws. You know when little children are running around, they're saying, hey, that's mine, give it back. They understand certain aspects of what it means to be just and fair, that I had this property first, and it's unjust for someone to confiscate it from me. And they understand perfectly well that if they take something from somebody else, they cry when you punish them, but typically they understand the punishment. They don't say, Mom, Dad, I have a whole philosophical argument against why that if they take something from somebody else, they cry when you punish them, but typically they understand the punishment. They don't say, Mom, Dad, I have a whole philosophical argument against why you're punishing me. They know in their heart they've done something wrong. Well, we have these senses of what is right and wrong. We also have the Ten Commandments in our own tradition. But according to Vittoria, the Ten Commandments are really spelling out principles that practically any people, really, if they reflect long enough, will understand and appreciate. And because we all possess this kind of sense of right and wrong, a basic sense, then this basic sense can become the basis for international rules of conduct. And these rules of conduct can morally bind even those who've never heard the gospel, or never heard of the Ten Commandments, or had even rejected the gospel, because we're basing ourselves on the idea that we all ultimately know that sheer conquest is wrong, and looting and pillaging is wrong. We know this because God has imprinted it on our hearts, and this becomes the basis for a common understanding of international obligation. Now, that is to say that peoples such as the peoples of the New World were thought to possess this basic sense of right and wrong, summed up in the Ten Commandments and in the Golden Rule, and so we could interact with them on the understanding that they understand these principles, but we have to understand and live according to them too. So what this means is that in the 16th century, Spanish theologians looked at the behavior of their own civilization. They held it up to critical scrutiny, and they found it wanting. They looked and said, we have failed to live up to the absolute moral standard that binds all people. They proposed that in matters of natural right, the other peoples of the world were their equals, and that the commonwealths even of pagan peoples were entitled to the same treatment that the nations of Christian Europe accorded to one another. Now that is something extraordinary in the history of the world. And we in no way wish to make light of what happened to the peoples in the New World, because many of them perished, sometimes in terrible circumstances, oftentimes due to disease, a non-volitional source, sometimes due to overwork. And it was something terrible in some ways, what happened to a great many of these people. But the very fact that the Spaniards could step back and say, my people have failed to live up to an absolute standard is something new in the world. A historian named Louis Hankey wrote a book called The Spanish Struggle for Justice in the Conquest of America. Now that's a strange title, isn't it? But what he's talking about is precisely what we've seen here. The Spanish theologians attempt to devise rules that would bind everybody and that would establish justice in the world. And their ability, the Spaniards' ability to look objectively at these foreign peoples and recognize their common humanity was no small achievement. In fact, this type of impartiality, this ability to look at the peoples of the world and be willing to apply the same rules to other peoples that you apply to your own, and that you would abide by the same rules that you expect others to abide by. this impartiality is not exactly embedded in every civilization. In fact, we need look no further, for example, than the American Indian cultures, which, for whatever their merits, did not possess the ability to look impartially at the world and hold themselves up to a common moral standard. The Harvard historian Samuel Eliot Morison said that the Indians of the same region or language group did not even have a common name for themselves, and that each tribe called itself something like "we the people" and referred to its neighbors by a word that meant the barbarians, or sons of she-dog, or something equally insulting. Well, if that's your view, that you are the people and everybody else are the barbarians or sons of the she-dog, how are you going to be able to come up with impartial rules governing both you and the barbarians? It's not going to happen. So the idea of an international order of states, some large, some small, of varying levels of civilization and refinement, operating on a principle of equality, one toward the other, this could not have found fertile ground amid that kind of narrow chauvinism, a kind of chauvinism that has been all too prevalent in the history of the world. So it's thanks to the Catholic conception of the fundamental unity of the human race that we're able to think in terms of universal principles governing all peoples. So when we criticize Spanish excesses in the New World, therefore, it's largely thanks to the moral tools provided by the Catholic theologians of Spain itself that we're able to do so. The Peruvian poet Mario Vargas Llosa, when he spoke about these Spanish critics of their own government's policy, he said this: "They fought against their fellow men and against the policies of their own country in the name of a moral principle that to them was higher than any principle of nation or state. This self-determination, this capacity for criticism of your own civilization could not have been possible among the Incas or any of the other pre-Hispanic cultures. In these cultures, as in the other great civilizations of history foreign to the West, the individual could not morally question the social organism of which he was a part." Well, let's conclude now by saying that we have seen that, in theory, the Catholic Church has set up and established and defended these universal moral principles. And perhaps they have been observed in the breach at times, but these are the principles. And the additional principle, of course, is that there's to be no forced conversion. That's in canon law. All these things are Catholic principles. What we're going to see next time is an aspect of modern history that's often been forgotten, when anti-Catholic or atheistic states in effect establish the opposite principle, that people have the opposite of rights because they're Catholic. Because they're Catholic, they can be imprisoned or tortured or killed. And we are once again going to see this glorious witness of Catholics in the face of devastation. Join me for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Today we're going to observe Western civilization turning against its own builders. We're going to look at some of the forgotten episodes of martyrdom in the modern period. So join me for stories of tragedy and heroism today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're talking about martyrdom, and we're talking about some of the forgotten episodes of martyrdom that have occurred within the Catholic world in the modern period. Some of them will be familiar to you, but others perhaps not. And yet each of them, it seems to me, should be known by everybody. Each of them would make an extraordinarily moving motion picture. And yet, nothing so far. That's a note to all you Catholic movie makers out there. There's no short supply of movies of great heroism. Now, I've chosen particular episodes that I think aren't especially well known or deserve to be better known. There are a great many others, and at the end of this episode I'm going to give you some reading suggestions. Because if you're like me, you just can't tell what you should be reading. You don't have 12 books by your bed or anything. You could always use a couple more. Well, I'm going to give you a couple at the end. But for right now, I want to go back to the 16th century and tell you briefly a story you may already know, but remind you of a figure you may have forgotten. And I want to talk about King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII of England would have been the last person people would have expected to persecute Catholics. After all, he wrote a book in defense of the Seven Sacraments in 1521 against Martin Luther. He had no sympathy for Martin Luther whatsoever. Now, I'm not going to go through the story of his annulment and his various marriages, because then we'd be here for a whole other series. But for now, we'll simply say that King Henry VIII wanted to annul his marriage, marry another woman, and the Pope did not approve it. But he did it anyway. And in fact, he took the church in England and broke it away from the church around the world and declared that from now on, in the mid-1530s, that he, the King of England, would be the head of the Catholic Church in England. So the universality of the church around the world was threatened by, in effect, this self-imposed act of schism. So what happened after that? Well, of course, there were people who objected to this. What right do you have to do this? Is the annulment of your marriage valid? Is your power to claim that you are the head of the Catholic Church, is that something that has any roots in church history? Can we abide this? Now, many of you know about the story of St. Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor who opposed what the king was doing and could not, in conscience, support him, and was executed. Now, St. Thomas More, in the year 2000, was declared by Pope John Paul II to be the patron saint of politicians, which I thought was a particularly mischievous move, meaning that politicians should, in effect, be so committed to their consciences and to the truth as to be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for them. But there is a forgotten figure in this story, and that's Bishop John Fisher of Rochester. John Fisher was a diminutive figure. He was a very old man and frail and sickly, and he was the one bishop who had the courage at that time to stand up and say that he could not accept what the king was doing. Now, there have been great times of heroism among Catholic bishops in the history of mankind. For example, during the French Revolution, Catholic bishops were exemplary in many cases. But here we had just the one example of John Fisher, and he was loved by everyone. And on that day when he came out of the Tower of London, holding his small Bible as they led him to be executed, the people gathered and watched. And he addressed them and told them, said to the Catholic people that I have come here to die for Christ's Catholic Church. And he was executed. But my favorite part of this is a popular story that followed thereafter, because his head, Bishop John Fisher's head, was placed on a pike and placed along with the heads of some monks who had also resisted the king on London Bridge. Now, during his life, John Fisher had been very pale in complexion and indeed sickly looking. But in death, with his head on that pike, his face took on a reddish hue, such that he looked healthier and more alive than ever. In fact, this was such a spectacle that people began making small pilgrimages to visit his head, such that the government finally just had to take it down. I sure hope that story is true, because they deserved to be rebuked by John Fisher even in his death. Now, 400 years exactly after the deaths of these two great men, in 1935, they were canonized. And so we call them St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher. But I taught Western civilization at the college level in New York for 7 years. And I always looked for a good textbook. And the textbook always told us about the heroism of St. Thomas More. And of course, there's the wonderful movie, Man for All Seasons. But I never found a single textbook that told us about the sacrifice of John Fisher, this glorious bishop who had been treated so badly by the regime, who had been maneuvered and manipulated into saying things that could be declared criminal and treasonous. His is an extraordinary witness, and we ought to have recourse to him very often. But even after the death of King Henry VIII in 1547, that wasn't the end of the troubles people had in England trying to follow the Pope. A couple years later, around 5,000 fall into the ditches and perish. Many female religious went to their deaths in this way, singing songs to the Lord as they did so, and forgiving their captors and tormentors. In the midst of all this, there was also the de-Christianization campaign. De-Christianization campaign in France. Now, what did that consist of? During the fanaticism of de-Christianization, a new calendar was introduced. Because, of course, if we want to de-Christianize the country, we certainly can't have a calendar dated from the life of Christ. So instead, we're going to date our calendar from the year we killed our king. That'll be the year 1. And the week became 10 days long, not 7. So it became impossible for the Catholic people, after a time, to know what day was Sunday. Well, thankfully, most people never adopted this silly calendar. But that was an example of the hostility toward the Catholic people. But beyond just that, bizarre ceremonies were carried out. Statues of saints were guillotined. The names of streets that had the word saint in them had the word saint removed. Churches were vandalized everywhere and property destroyed as an attempt to try to wipe out the Christian inheritance. In fact, even worship itself was discontinued in all but the remotest areas of the country. Here was de-Christianization. In fact, even the priests who had taken the oath of loyalty to the regime were now told that was not enough. If you want to show that you are loyal to revolutionary France, you must abjure your ordination altogether. Many of them refused to do that. Thousands of them fled the country. 10,000 priests went to England alone. England, an anti-Catholic country at that time, welcomed them. And in fact, as some historians have said, like Michael Davies, in fact, what the result of that was that English people got to see Catholic priests for themselves. They no longer heard about Catholic priests just in caricature. They met these men for themselves and saw how heroic they were and what they were able to do. And it astonished them how great these men were. And this experience they had meeting all these Catholic priests went a long way in the 19th century toward lifting the restrictions against Catholicism in that country. But this is not even the worst of what happened to Catholics. A war of extermination was waged in the Vendée region of France, and this episode has been almost entirely forgotten. It was not forgotten by Pope John Paul II, who visited the Vendée region, spoke about the Vendée region in a French visit in 1996. And when we come back, we're going to talk about those men and women, what the Pope had to say, and more examples of heroism when we come back to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. So I'll see you in a minute. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we've been talking about cases in which Western civilization, in effect, has turned against her own builders. And we've seen the suffering that Catholics have endured in a great many contexts. And I'm just giving the tip of the iceberg, I promise, of what has happened to Catholics over the centuries that nobody knows about. Now, we started off talking about the French Revolution, and I mentioned that the Vendée region of France was subject to a particularly vicious campaign during the Revolution. The Vendée was the area that was most resistant to the French revolutionaries. And orders were given to go into the Vendée and exterminate these people. Every single person who was moving should be killed. People should be bayoneted and hacked to bits. They were ordered to do that. But the people of Vendée stood up and resisted the best they could. And when Pope John Paul II was in France in 1996, he was there, incidentally, to observe the 1500th anniversary of the baptism of Clovis, who was the Frankish king who accepted Christian baptism and thus bestowed upon France the title of the eldest daughter of the Church. The Pope was there to commemorate that. But he spoke about the particular sacrifice of the people in the Vendée. And he said, "You who were born in the land of the Vendée are the heirs of men and women who were courageous enough to remain faithful to the Church of Jesus Christ at a time when her freedom and independence were threatened. In the numerous acts of witness that have come down to us, it is moving to see that the people of the Vendée remained attached to their parishes and their priests in spite of the cruelty of persecution. Now today, if you even say the word Vendée, with how many people will it ring bells? Essentially none. These are episodes that are in serious danger of being forgotten. No one has taught them in the first place. But if we have respect for all peoples, we need to know about the sufferings of all peoples. Now, I'd like to make particular mention of what happened to Catholics at the beginning of the Russian Revolution. Because, of course, most Russians, inasmuch as they were Christians, were in the Orthodox Church. So we sometimes forget about the fate of the Catholic Church because it was relatively not so numerous. But still, I'm interested in this episode because of how much it reveals about anti-Catholic persecution and modern atheistic governments. Now, we're talking about the late 19-teens into the early 1920s. These are the early years of the Bolshevik Revolution, when the communists have taken over and Lenin is in charge. Now, initially, what they did was they made it a crime to engage in religious education to anyone under 18. So you can't form the minds of the children. The communists will form the minds of the children. They also made it illegal to do a variety of things. They made it very difficult, if not impossible, for the church to own property. They established atheistic propaganda and encouraged and fostered atheistic propaganda all over the place. In fact, in some cases, churches were replaced with public restrooms as a way of showing, well, the greatest possible disdain to the Christian faith of the people. I have a friend who, round about the early 1980s, perhaps the late 1970s, was being taken on a guided tour of Russia. And the tour guide was giving the usual propaganda. Look at the religious freedom we encourage in Russia. Look at all of our churches. And my friend impertinently asked, oh, how many of them were built since 1917? Total silence, of course. He was never invited back, needless to say. That's an unaskable question. But early on, early 1920s, you start to see a campaign against the Catholic churches in which the regime is claiming we need to take the valuables out of these churches, anything that might be made out of precious metals, because Russia, in large part thanks to the stupidity of its government, was suffering from a devastating famine. And the claim was we need to melt these sacred vessels down to sell them to make money to provide for famine relief. Well, clearly, this was an attempt to break the Catholic churches, to show who was in charge. They didn't actually need that money for famine relief, because the United States and other places were sending famine relief money to Russia. And we now know, now that the Soviet archives have been opened up, that the government was taking that food aid money and using it to buy machine guns from Germany. They didn't need the money for this purpose. And in fact, Pope Benedict XV, who was Pope from 1914 to 1922, even made an offer to the Russian government. He said, the Vatican will give you an amount of money equivalent to the value of those vessels if you just leave them alone. He never got an answer to that offer, which is all you need to know. And so, in effect, stormtroopers marched into churches and began vandalizing them. Most churches were vandalized. The only ones who weren't were ones where it was determined that there was nothing sufficiently of value there. Now, beyond this, we have cases of priests being executed or imprisoned just for doing normal priestly functions, providing religious education, or trying to prevent the stormtroopers from taking their vessels. One priest, for example, got down on his knees and begged his congregation to block and protect the tabernacle. He was tried and convicted of falling demonstratively on his knees. Did you know that was a crime? That's apparently a crime. And that reminds us that in these revolutionary regimes, there is no respect for law whatsoever. Law is what the judge says it is. In fact, in Russia, historian Richard Pipes says Russia was the first country on earth to ever outlaw law. That if you wanted to be a judge in Russia, all you needed to do was be literate. You didn't have to have any legal training. You didn't have to have any legal training, because we don't need legal training. We don't need previous precedent and previous law. All we need is somebody with a good communist revolutionary conscience who knows how to mete out communist justice in one case after another. In fact, one government official said to the Russian leader Lenin, "Our Commissariat of Justice really should be renamed the Commissariat of Social Extermination, shouldn't it?" And Lenin said, "Yes, it should, but we can't say that." So that's how they come up with crimes like falling demonstratively on your knees. A revolutionary judge simply makes this stuff up as he goes along. So the first show trials in Russia were not under Stalin, when Stalin would take potential political rivals or fellow communists and put them on trial and accuse them of treachery and force them to engage in ridiculous and obviously absurd confessions. Those are sometimes thought of as the first show trials, where the job was to humiliate the accused before executing him. The first show trials were actually under Lenin, when priests were put on trial for having defended their property or having carried out the simplest and most benign of priestly functions. The job was to humiliate and break these people. And yet again, this is forgotten. This is beyond forgotten. What about Spain in the 20th century during the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939? What happened there? In terms of Catholics, we have some of the most grotesque atrocities carried out by people. For example, one historian tells us, in Spain, which of course is one of Europe's most staunchly Catholic countries, large numbers of Catholics were just butchered solely for being Catholic. Unlike the martyrdoms in most parts of the world, whole sectors of the religious community were liquidated. At least 6,832 priests and religious were martyred, including 13 bishops. In the 20th century, probably no country witnessed so much bloodshed among its clergy. Another source, an incalculable number of laypersons were killed because of their religious associations, either as well-known churchgoers, members of fraternal and charitable religious organizations, or as the fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, and friends of clerics. Some were killed because they professed their faith by wearing some outward symbol of belief, perhaps a religious medal or a scapular. Some were killed for acts of charity, for granting refuge to clerics attempting to escape this terrible fury. It is impossible to determine the number of these lay persons who were slain for their faith. And nor was the anti-clericalism limited to killing. Thousands of churches were burned. Religious objects were profaned. Nuns' tombs were opened, and the petrified mummies displayed to ridicule. And religious ceremonies were burlesqued. Indeed, practically any imaginable anti-clerical act was not only possible, but likely. And still another writer tells us, as they entered a village, that is, in effect, anti-Catholic stormtroopers, you may as well call them, their first object of attack was the church. There, the communists and their henchmen would round up the priests and religious, as well as anyone who protested, wreak all kinds of destruction and sacrilege, and then pour round after round of ammunition into the tabernacle of the parish church. Now, unfortunately, my friends, we could go on and on. We could talk about the sacrifices Catholics made under the terrible Nazi regime, about the thousands of priests interned at Dachau. We could talk about the sufferings in Mexico. There's so much we can talk about because there were sufferings all over the world in the 20th century. In Africa, all over the world, people perished because of their faith. Now, unfortunately, this is largely a forgotten story. The Black Book of Communism does tell a lot of the atrocities of the communists, and that is a very important thing because people, in effect, don't seem to care or have forgotten about these crimes. But that book doesn't really give us the information we might want about people who died specifically because they were Catholics and not just because they were anti-communist. So the book I would recommend is a book by Robert Royal, called Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century. Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century. And he gives a history of what happened in the 20th century around the world. And he says that in terms of people we can clearly identify as having specifically died for the faith, it's in the hundreds of thousands. We can't forget those people. And these are people who gave the same witness as those people in the early centuries who helped their own persecutors. These are people who, when they died, they forgave these people and they blessed them. That's why Tertullian said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians, because people are so moved by their testimony. Pope John Paul II quoted the words of Christ, "Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven." And the Pope said, how well these words of Christ fit the countless witnesses to the faith in the last century, insulted and persecuted, but never broken by the power of evil. Where hatred seemed to corrupt the whole of life, leaving no escape from its logic, they proved that love is stronger than death. Within terrible systems of oppression which disfigured man, in places of pain, amid the hardest of privations, through senseless marches, exposed to cold and hunger, tortured, suffering in so many ways, they loudly proclaimed their loyalty to Christ crucified and risen. Countless numbers refused to yield to the cult of the false gods of the 20th century and were sacrificed by communism, Nazism, by the idolatry of state or race. Many others fell in the course of ethnic or tribal wars because they had rejected a way of thinking foreign to the gospel of Christ. Some went to their death because, like the Good Shepherd, they decided to remain with their people despite intimidation. On every continent and throughout the entire 20th century, there have been those who preferred to die rather than betray the mission which was theirs. And they did so in the spirit of Christ. But their stories have been forgotten. We need to remember them because these stories can inspire, and they in fact can move people to conversion. Well, next time, we're going to wrap up our series and look at what the Church has done for the West and how we can tell more people about it. So join me next time. Thanks. Over the past 12 episodes, we've seen how the Catholic Church built Western civilization. But where is Western civilization going? What's next? What can we do about it? Join me today for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. This is our last episode. So let's take a moment and take stock of what it is that we've seen thus far. Because I think when you put it all together, it's a pretty impressive package for the Catholic Church after all. For instance, we went after the subject of science right away, because there I think people are most likely to disparage the Church or to think not especially well of her, that she has not distinguished herself very well when it comes to science. But to the contrary, we've seen that modern historians of science, who would know something about this, they do this for a living, are now no longer saying that about the Catholic Church, that she's just an enemy of science. We've actually seen that the Church, in fact, introduced into our civilization critical ideas that made it possible for science to develop. In fact, it's not just a coincidence that science developed in a largely Catholic milieu, in a world that was formed by Catholic ideas, but rather it makes perfect sense, as we saw earlier. Beyond that, we looked at great priest-scientists whose names have been forgotten, but who achieved great things in the sciences. And at that time, I urged people, and I renew that urge today, to consider learning more about and even writing about the Jesuit scientists. These people accomplished so much in the sciences, it's absolutely astonishing, and yet no book about it? That is an injustice, my friends. Let's hope that it's rectified. Or how about charity? We all know the Catholic Church does great charitable work. But do people realize how great it is? Do people realize that there was nothing like Catholic charity in the ancient world in terms of the amount of charity that was done or the spirit in which that charity took place? Nothing like it. The idea that I'm going to give something to someone purely out of a desire to help that person, with no self-interest involved, but simply out of love. This is a revolutionary idea, but we take it for granted, don't we? When we hear that somebody's been charitable, that's exactly what we think about, that the person did something without any thought for his own welfare, but did something solely to help somebody else, we think of that as being charity. But why does that come naturally to us? Why do we think of that as charity? Well, it's because we live in a civilization that still bears the residue of its Catholic influence. If we were living in ancient Greece and Rome, we wouldn't have these ideas about charity. So people go through life thinking this way about charity, never even knowing that it's their Catholic inheritance that has given them those ideas. Well, we should point that out, shouldn't we? But then there's the university system. Who gave birth to the university system in the High Middle Ages? The Catholic Church. Who made that possible? Who fostered it? Who protected it? And who encouraged the kind of vigorous, rational debate that occurred within the precincts of the university? Of course, it was the Church. In fact, the Church encouraged the asking of questions. The whole tradition of scholasticism consists of asking questions and being certain that recourse to both authority and reason can resolve these questions. There was a confidence in the cathedral school at Chartres and in a great many other Catholic thinkers that God had not given us our rational natures in vain, but He intended us to use them. We should use our rational nature. We should use our reason to understand the world around us. And that reason, properly applied, will not mislead us. We've also seen that the idea of rights comes out of the Catholic Church too. Now this, for a long time, has been assumed to be a teaching that comes from secular thinkers, or non-Catholic thinkers at the very least, perhaps in the 17th century, little before, a little after. But we've seen that in fact the idea of rights, natural rights, rights that inhere in us as human beings naturally, rights that mean that you can't invade my person, you can't kill me, you can't steal from me, these things that inhere in us as human beings, these ideas developed out of the Catholic Church and her own canon lawyers. And here I rely on an important book by Brian Tierney, who's one of the great experts on the idea of rights. He has a great book called The Idea of Natural Rights. And it's there where you see the most systematic refutation of the idea that rights just came out of nowhere in the 17th century. He shows that they came out of the heart of the Church. Now, we've also seen that international law comes out of the Catholic Church too. International law, which is closely related to the idea of rights, comes out of the Catholic Church. Because international law says that some countries don't have more rights than others, but that each state has an equal dignity, regardless of whether the ruler of that state is Catholic or non-Catholic. If his only crime, so to speak, is being non-Catholic, you can't just depose him for that, because his state has dignity and the right of self-government just the way as any Catholic state would have, or state populated by Catholics. So international law, the idea there's an absolute moral standard that governs the interaction of states. Where does this come from? It comes from the Catholic Church with Francisco de Vitoria and Francisco Suarez and de Soto and all these other thinkers. Even law itself, law domestically, is indebted to the Catholic Church because the canon law was the first modern legal system in Europe. Because for the first time, church law was brought together systematically and presented in a coherent whole, where all contradictions that might have existed have been reconciled. That's what modern states in Western Europe did when they were developing their own legal systems. They used the model of canon law as to how you go about doing that. Now, in our first episode, I made brief mention of the study of economics. Now, economics really is an interesting science, so I don't want to hear any objections to economics. But economics is often thought to have emerged in the 18th century. In the 18th century, sort of deistic thinkers, or thinkers who certainly weren't Catholic, just suddenly came up with the idea of economics, just kind of poured out of their heads. But in fact, that's not what historians today are saying. For the past half century, historians who write about the history of economic thinking are now saying that it's not Adam Smith in the 1770s who just gave birth to economics, just came all out of his gigantic head. But instead, they're now pointing to a people called the late scholastics, who were Spanish thinkers. Well, they weren't all Spanish, but the best ones were Spanish. So all you Spaniards out there, congratulations. As the source of modern economic thought, the late scholastics are really the source. One of the great 20th century economists, Joseph Schumpeter, said, "It is they who come nearer than does any other group to having been the founders of scientific economics. And there's been much scholarship written about this ever since Schumpeter wrote in the 1950s. Modern historians of science have continued to uncover the critical and important insights into economic thought of these people. For example, Raymond de Roover, Marjorie Grice Hutchinson, and scholars who are still alive like Alejandro Chafuin and Harry Vereiser at the University of Detroit. This is an important contribution as well. Now let me give an example of what I mean here. In the 16th century, when precious metals coming from the New World began to reach Europe, people noticed that prices rose. So what they recognized was there was a kind of a fixed cause and effect relationship going on here, that there was a relationship, some kind of a relationship, between the level of prices and the amount of money. So in effect, this was like an economic law. So they understood scientifically that there were relationships at work in the world of economics. This is an essential breakthrough. They also wrote great moral treatises relating to economics, like Juan de Mariana wrote a fantastic treatise denouncing inflation, when governments inflate the money supply and thereby make each unit of money worth less. He denounced this as a terrible, inexcusable crime. Kings used to call in the coins in their realm and then clip them and save some of the metal and then return the coins to the people. And of course, he's gained an awful lot for himself, and they're stuck with these crummy coins they have to exchange at the old value. Juan de Mariana denounced this because he understood the economics behind it. Now, how did this go unheralded for so long? Why for so long did we all think Adam Smith had a why for so long did we all think Adam Smith had a gigantic head? Like, why did we think this? In part, it's because the people who wrote this stuff, the late scholastics, they didn't write books on economics for the most part. They wrote great moral treatises. And in the course of their moral treatises, they referred to economic topics, but they never had a book that said, here's our stuff on economics. So it was easy to overlook it. In addition, they wrote in Latin, and by and large, scholars today, particularly in economics, are not known for reading Latin. And so this was simply forgotten. And only now are we digging it out and saying, Catholics did this too. It's unbelievable. So I would say that we put this all together, and we haven't even talked about art and architecture. I assume that's taken for granted. The Catholic Church built Western civilization. And yet, not to beat a dead horse here, but this is one dead horse that amply merits a substantial beating. The European Union Constitution refuses to acknowledge the Catholic inheritance. Not a word. Western civilization comes from the ancient world, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and that's it. And whatever happened in between, nobody really knows, couldn't possibly have been very important. Seriously, only an imbecile could believe this now, given all the evidence that's out there. But this is what we're told by the European Union. And it can't just be ignorance. It isn't just that they're dummies and they haven't done their reading. It can't be that. Because nobody who would presume to make a statement officially on behalf of the European Union could be that uneducated. It's frankly because of hostility toward the church. There is a hostility toward the church. We all know it. And in fact, this colors people's statements and judgments. They don't want to give the church credit for things. My own theory is that one of the reasons a lot of secular intellectuals despise the church is that the church, in effect, reproaches them for their immoral lifestyles. They don't like being told they're not supposed to do this and that, and every time they see the church, it's a reproach to them. And so therefore they have to wipe it out, they have to destroy it, they have to ignore it. But we refuse to go away, don't we? We refuse to go away. Well, after the break, we're going to talk about the state of Western civilization right now. Look around at the art world a little bit, the state of things, and see what, if anything, we can do about this. And what can we do to take this knowledge and spread it out there to the world? I wrote a book called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, because I hoped it could help to spread this knowledge among the general population. Let's see what else we can try to do to make people aware of what an extraordinary treasure the world has in the Catholic Church. Supernaturally, yes, but even on a natural level, all the glorious things she's done. How do we spread that around? Let's talk about that after the break, and we'll see you in just a minute. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we're sort of summing things up and then looking forward. We're looking at things the Church has done in the past and then thinking about what are we going to do in the future? What are we going to do to redeem Western civilization? Build it back up again to where it belongs. Now, I think if you were to take a quick glance, for example, at the world of art today, it's probably not fair to say all of modern art is just a complete disaster. I don't think anyone would really say that. However, I think we can say that there seems to be a relationship between a civilization's view as to whether there really is a transcendent, there's something that is beyond our experience, and a civilization that doesn't believe that believes in materialism. Materialism in this sense doesn't mean greed, it means believing that matter is all there is. If something isn't physical, then it doesn't exist. That's what materialism teaches. And it seems to me fairly obvious that the type of art you would see in those different types of civilizations would differ from each other. And this is a point that Jude Doherty made. He's the Dean Emeritus of the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America. And he's made this point. He asked the question, could a great Gothic cathedral, or indeed Gothic architecture in general, could that have been built in a materialistic culture? And likewise, could some of the hideous things that we see around us all the time, what Doherty calls Lego set architecture, we're surrounded by everywhere, would that have been built in an age and a culture that believed in the transcendent? When you, in effect, when you believe in materialism, what you're saying is that there is no meaning to life. If all there is matter, if matter is just dead, it has no purposes, then there is no meaning to anything if there's no transcendent. And if you really believe that life has no meaning, it would be a miracle if that belief weren't in fact reflected in your art. And we see that. Of course, we see that everywhere. Now, I suppose it's shooting fish in a barrel to criticize some of the excesses of modern art, so I'm not going to do that. There's a little bit of that in my book, and you can find that all over the place. But I do remember walking into my classroom back in the years when I was a professor in New York, and I had a newspaper article, and I said to them, this is a Western Civ course, I said, ladies and gentlemen, I want to update you on the state of Western civilization. And I read to them this news item. And it was a news item about the Turner Prize exhibition in England, which was a prestigious art prize. And one of the exhibits was called The Lights Going On and Off. And in this exhibit, the artist, so-called, flicked on and off the lights of the facility. And this produced an interesting effect, apparently, and that was his work of art. I know what you're all thinking. I can flick lights on and off too. I know. I'm thinking the same thing. Also in recent years, at major prize competitions, more than once, the janitorial staff has mistakenly thrown these art exhibits in the garbage, assuming that they were trash. What does that say to you about the state of the civilization? Now, if we Catholics don't defend ourselves, as I said at the beginning, nobody is going to do it for us. We've got a glorious civilization behind us. We've produced some extraordinary art that is admired by people all over the world. Now, it's true, though, that we're not Catholics because we produced great art. We're not Catholics because the Church helped to foster the university, or because the Church encouraged the sciences. These are all wonderful things. That's not why we're Catholic. But there are a couple of benefits that come from knowing this information. And the first one is that a lot of people do believe a lot of negative things about the Church, don't they? A lot of people believe these negative things. So if we can show them that they're mistaken, that in fact a lot of these misconceptions are exactly that. They're just misconceptions without historical foundation, we will have struck down an obstacle to their conversion. So it is important to know this knowledge, even if it's not the reason that we're Catholics. It will help us when we interact with people who have deeply embedded prejudices. But remember, nobody's going to defend ourselves if we don't defend us. We have to defend ourselves. We have to be prepared to tell people these things when they come up and say the Church has been nothing but a blight. We have to have an answer for that, because they're not going to have the answer. We need to give them that answer. But secondly, these things help to confirm our own faith. And what I mean by that is that we should expect Christ's church to bear such wonderful temporal fruits? Because if the church really is what she claims to be, she's the bride of Christ, she's a divine institution, then naturally we would expect her to bear great supernatural fruits in the form of grace and the sacraments. But we should also expect her to bear great temporal fruits. And when we in fact confirm that, and we see that, it helps to confirm our faith, doesn't it? It helps to confirm our faith. Now, looking at the state of Western civilization, our past couple of popes have been frankly saddened and have noted the attempt by people to pretend that the Catholic inheritance is dispensable or perhaps doesn't even exist. You cannot think of constructing a common European house neglecting the very identity of the peoples of our continent. That's what Pope Benedict XVI said recently. He's very interested in this subject of how do we redeem Europe. Pope John Paul II, on one of the 9 or so trips to Poland that he took during his pontificate, said this to the crowd. Said this to the crowd. Giving in to desire, to sex, to consumption, that is the Europeanism that some supporters of our entry into Europe think we should accept. But we mustn't become part of that Europe. We, he said, were the ones who created Europe, and with much more effort than those who claim exclusive rights to Europeanism. What is their criterion, the Pope said? Freedom. But which freedom? The freedom to take the life of an unborn child? Brothers and sisters, he concluded, I protest against this concept of Europe held by the West. And this message must be shouted loudly from this land of martyrs. Europe is waiting for redemption. The world needs a redeemed Europe. Now, I myself am a convert to the Catholic faith. And when I initially converted, I converted in large part because of theological and scriptural reasons and a lot of study. And I knew I had done the right thing. I knew I had acquired the pearl of great price. Well, this project has been, in effect, like a second type of conversion for me. I've renewed all the enthusiasm that I had for the church when I first entered. Because I knew a lot of this stuff about the history before I wrote How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, but I learned a lot more as I did it. And I said to myself, this is it. This is the institution that Christ established. Look at it. Look at all the wonderful fruits. Now, how are we going to get this out there? Well, I would say a key method is educating ourselves, and that includes educating the next generation. So it seems to me that either homeschooling or Catholic schooling that includes sound historical study is absolutely indispensable. Because let's be honest, a lot of people in the world are not particularly knowledgeable about the stuff we've covered here. So it only takes 2 or 3 really well thought out sentences to knock over their whole case. So if we got our kids ready so that when they go out there and they find themselves fighting against anti-Catholic propaganda, if they're ready to meet it on its own terms, people are going to be stunned. They're not going to know what to say because nobody's got a good historical foundation. But disproportionately, I believe that students who are being homeschooled, even though they're a minority, they will still disproportionately, out of proportion to their numbers, be numbered among the educated people of our world to come. And they will be ready for the usual claims made against the church. That's essential. We're all set to get started homeschooling our kids. I can't wait to do it. But in the case of my own conversion, I remember, if I may be pardoned this personal conclusion, I remember I was on the verge of converting. And, people wanted to send me books showing me why Protestantism was false and Catholicism was true. And I appreciated that, and that was good. I did want to know those things. I did want to be able to answer the arguments of Luther. But ultimately what happened to me, and the whole story would take a little bit longer, but what happened to me was I reached a point at which I came to the conclusion that I wanted to be a Catholic. I pretty much knew I wanted to be a Catholic. All of a sudden, this fascinating and extraordinary and gigantic institution was just staring me in the face. 2,000 years of tradition staring me in the face. And even then, I knew some of her achievements in Western civilization as well. And frankly, I know I shouldn't put it quite this way, but I want to be honest, I just suddenly felt stupid. I just thought that all this time, I've had this institution and all its glorious benefits and all the wonderful things she's done and all her beauty staring me in the face, and I haven't immediately rushed to embrace her. Frankly, I just felt stupid. I didn't really need books showing me why I had been wrong before. I knew there'd be time enough to study all the ins and outs. I just wanted to learn the faith. Just teach me the faith. Show me what the church teaches. That's what I want. I read Father Hardin's Great Catechism. I just absorbed it, and I said, yes, this is what I've been thirsting for. And I bring this up because I have a friend who contacted me not long ago, and he's having second thoughts. He's a Protestant, and he's thinking maybe he wants to become a Catholic. And my first instinct was, let me send him all these books showing him why he's wrong to be a Protestant. And I realized, you know what, he's going through just what I went through at that time. He just feels like kind of a doofus, that all this time he's neglected the pearl of great price that's staring him right in the face. This great institution, the most beautiful institution in the world. So instead, I just sent him books that explain the faith. Here is what it is. That is what converts people. And so when I finally converted, I said to myself, you know, no longer do I have to feel alienated from this extraordinary institution that has built the very civilization in which I live. I'm part of her now. And all those saints who lived from that 1,000-year period that Lutherans despised as having been unbiblical, they became my friends. I could be friends with St. Anselm, whom we talked about in this series. I could be friends with St. Thomas Aquinas. I wasn't alienated and separated from them. I was united to them in the bond of the communion of saints. This, in effect, was what helped bring about my conversion, and why this historical project for me has in effect brought back so many wonderful memories, that all these things are what brought me in, ultimately, in the beginning. Now, one of my favorite quotations from the saints comes from St. Thomas More, who said that nobody on his deathbed ever regretted having been a Catholic. Now, isn't that true? Speaking to an audience of Catholics and non-Catholics, I can assure you that that is true. Now, over these 13 weeks, including today, it's been a real pleasure, if I may quote some other people in television, to come into your living rooms, and I'm deeply honored that you've welcomed me. I hope that some of the material that we've covered has been helpful to you, has made it easier for you to defend the Catholic faith, and has, in your case, as in mine, helped you to fall in love with her all the more. And so I wish you all the blessings of God, and I say to you, thank you very much for joining me, and God bless you, and perhaps we'll meet again sometime in the future. Thanks so much for being with me for the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods.